Today we're doing chapter 4 of Jerome's Introduction to Latin. Here we have chapter 4, first and second conjugation verbs, the present system. So the present system being the three tenses, the present, the imperfect, and the future. Imperfect is a shorthand term for what's really the past imperfect. That is an action in the past that is not complete. And there's a variety of translations here. There's I was giving. There's also I used to give, which we'll call the habitual imperfect. I kept on giving, the frequentative imperfect. I tried to give, the conative imperfect. And I began to give, the inchoative or inceptive imperfect. You'll find all these terms in Allen and Greeno's New Latin Grammar, the reference grammar that I recommend in all of my Latin classes. So we'll skip to the back to Lacuna set 4. We have Profeta in Deserto, the prophet in the desert. Number 2, viae erant in deserto. There were roads in the desert, or paths in the desert. Although a better word for path is semita. You'll see it in the Lord is my shepherd psalm in the Vulgate, Psalm 22/23. Number 3, vias in deserto videbamus. We saw roads in the desert. As long as we understand that we saw doesn't mean simple past, but imperfect, in the sense of every Sunday afternoon we would go for a walk and we saw roads in the desert. Or we used to see, we kept on seeing, we tried to see, we began to see. Number 4, vias quae in deserto erant videbamus. We used to see the roads that were in the desert. Number 5, no one saw the sun. Nemo filium videbat. Or no one used to see the sun. No one was seeing the sun. Number 6, filius columbam videbat. The son saw the dove, or was seeing or began to see a dove. Number 7, no one ever used to see God. Nemo deum videbat. Number 8, he was shouting in the desert. In deserto clamabat. Number 9, Profeta in deserto de viis clamabat. The prophet in the desert was shouting about the roads or the paths. Or you could say the prophet was shouting about the paths in the desert. The ambiguity is going to be there no matter what, but you can arrange the words in such a way as a writer or a speaker to suggest a particular modifier go with a particular word. So here, because in deserto comes right after profeta, where an adjective would often come that's modifying profeta, we think of him as the prophet in the desert, rather than that he was shouting in the desert or that he was shouting about roads in the desert. But with these simple example sentences, as we've seen before, sentences that are very small tend to be ambiguous. Number 10, De viis Domini clamabit. He will shout about the ways of the Lord. Number 11, we will offer testimony. Testimonium perhibebimus. Notice that the correct pronunciation of a Latin word depends on the penult, that syllable right there, right? So there are 3 syllables working backwards from the end of a word. There's the ultima, the last syllable. So for clamabat, it would be bat. That's the ultima. And then the almost last syllable is the penult, ma. And then the one that comes before that is called the antepenult, ante penultima, cla, ma, bat. And the way you decide where to put the stress on a Latin word is if the penult is long, it receives the stress. So we say clamabat, or we say clamabit. If the penult is short, then the stress recedes to the antepenult. So, for example, in the word testimonium, right, we have ni, mo. So we have neum, monium, and we say testimonium. We don't say testimonium, we say testimonium because that I right there is short. Now, there's an exception to this rule, which is when a syllable is long by position. So here, this E, you see it doesn't have a long mark, but it is followed by two consonants. So as we've seen before on many occasions, that makes the syllable long by position. So the syllabification of this word goes to, ser to, de ser to. And the correct pronunciation is to put the stress on ser, the penult, because it's long by position. That is a short, naturally short vowel followed by two consonants. What happens is that you can cut the syllables here and here, whoops, and here when you have two consonants. And so what this is, the effect is that this is called a closed syllable because it ends with a consonant and begins with a consonant. So we say deserto. Right. So we will offer testimony, testimonium per hebebemos. Number 12, testimonium de profeta per hebebam. I was offering testimony about the prophet. Number 13, I will dwell in the desert. In deserto habitabo. Number 14, neque in deserto, neque in tenebris. Neither in the desert nor in the shadows or in the darkness. So here's a word that is always plural. It's a tantum plurale, tenebrae, tenebrarum. And we can say shadows in the plural if we like, or we can say darkness. There's no other word for darkness in Latin, or rather, there's no more appropriate word for darkness than tenebrae. Number 15, numquam in tenebris habitabimus. We shall never dwell in the darkness. Number 16, they dwelled in the shadows. In tenebris habitabant. Number 17, evil men dwell in the shadows. Mali in tenebris habitabant. Whoops, that's wrong. Mali in tenebris habitant. You see what happened there? We changed the tense of the verb. In number 16, it was habitabant, and in number 17, we changed to habitant, present tense. So there were two changes from 16 to 17. We added a subject, evil men. But notice that we only needed the word mali. We didn't need the word weary. If you put the word weary, it's not wrong. It's just not necessary. And one of the hallmarks of classical style, not just classical Latin, but classical Greek, classical literature, classical art, architecture, and so on, is economy. That is, using the minimum words necessary. So, for a review on what's going on there with evil men, Mali, go back to chapter 3, paragraph 3 on substantives. All right, number 18. Numquam tenebras belli videbamus. We never used to see the darkness of war, or we never saw the shadows of war. Number 19. Neque nunc, neque tunc clamabamus. Neither now nor then did we shout, or were we shouting. Number 20. The Son will tell men the words of God. Filius, viris, verba Dei, narrabit. Filius, nominative. Viris, dative, indirect object, with verbs of giving, showing, or telling. Verba Dei, accusative, genitive. Narrabit, he will tell, future tense. All right, let's back up to the previous page and do the readings. Number 1, nemo umquam Deum videbat. No one ever used to see God. Number 2, unigenitus filius qui apud Deum habitat prophetam in deserto videbit. The only begotten Son, who dwells with God, will see the prophet in the desert. Number 3, Iudai qui ex levitis erant, Ioannem de Christo interrogabant. The Jews or Judeans who were from the Levites, were questioning John about the Christ. Number 4, Ioannes Levitis respondebat, quibus negabat. John responded to the Levites, to whom he said no, or to whom he kept saying no, or to whom he kept denying it. Number 5, Propheta quem filius Dei illuminabat, Christus esse negabat. The prophet whom the Son of God illuminated kept denying to be the Christ. Or we could say, kept denying that he was the Christ. This is what's called an indirect statement, or oratio obliqua, indirect speech. Number 6, Jesus Christus de quo propheta in deserto clamabat, veram viam suis dabit. Jesus Christ, about whom the prophet in the desert was shouting, will give the true way to his own, or to his people. Suis here is another substantive. Chapter 3, paragraph 3. We add man, woman, or thing based on the gender. But in the plural, we don't need to add anything because we do this in English too, right? We say, blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor, and so on. That's just a plural adjective that's a substantive. Number 7, in deserto, neque clamabamos, neque unigenitum filium videbamos. In the desert, neither were we shouting, nor were we seeing the only begotten Son. And there you might want to translate in the desert at the end of your translation. We were not seeing either. We were not shouting or seeing the only begotten Son in the desert. Number 8, filium Dei ante prophetam videbimus. We will see the Son of God before the prophet. Number 9, Andreas et Philippus, Petro de Christo, de quo Ioannes clamabat, narrabunt. Andrew and Philip will tell Peter about Christ, about whom John was shouting. Notice Petro here is dative after narrabunt. Again, for verbs of giving, showing, or telling, we'll have a dative indirect object to go with our accusative direct object. Although here, we don't have an accusative direct object at all. We still have that dative indirect object because of narrabunt. Number 10, aut Deum qui in caelis habitat interrogabitis, aut vestri. Either you will ask or question God who dwells in heaven or in the heavens, or your people will. In other words, because vestri is nominative and we have out, we set up a parallel. And the really brilliant thing that Latin can do, and that we can do too, but we don't do it quite as much or nearly as much, is once you set up the parallel, once you establish the parallel with that conjunction and with vestri being nominative plural parallel to the subject of interrogabitis, you can imply the whole rest of the clause that's parallel and expect the reader to supply it himself. So either you or your people will question God who dwells in heaven or in the heavens. All right.